Welcome back for part 2 of our lecture on caffeine. We'll be switching hot beverages now and discussing tea. Tea is another beverage that's been consumed for a large part of human history, and it has been consumed for so long that, again, we're back to legend as the source of the first human use of caffeine. So with tea, the particular genus and species that we'll be discussing here is Camellia sinensis. This is and derived from an evergreen plant. And the legend here is that the founder of Zen Buddhism cut off his eyelids to remain awake while meditating, and that this plant actually grew from where his eyelids touched the earth. And then the leaves from that plant were then used to make the drink. So we go back again to legend for the source of how this became a source of caffeine for humans. Now, tea does have an extensive history. We do have evidence as long ago as 8350 for its use as a medicinal product, and then in 780 we see evidence of its use for non-medical uses, so more for the pleasure of its consumption than for its potential health benefits. So in terms of the spread of the use of tea, again, we see the influence of the Dutch here. The Dutch were the ones who brought tea to Europe in 1610, and in the 17th century we also saw the English East India Company. If you're familiar with English history, this commercial entity was a very important financial and political influence in Europe around, or in England around this time. So they imported tea from China, and they were the only ones who did it. So they created a monopoly that was very financially lucrative for the company. We also saw major marketing campaigns at the time that promoted switching from coffee to tea, sometimes for its health benefits or its alleged health benefits. So this idea that tea is an inherently British thing is actually something that only began in the 17th and 18th centuries. Of course, tea played an important part in the American Revolution. As British citizens, many Americans before the Revolutionary War consumed tea at the same rates as their English counterparts. But when the government in England tried to increase the taxes on tea, that was kind of the beginnings of the widespread revolt, or contributed to the widespread revolt. We saw the Boston Tea Party depicted in the picture here, where a ship arrived with tea imported from England, and the colonists dumped the tea over the side of the ship into Boston Harbor, creating that Boston Tea Party. And this is actually where we saw that phrase, taxation without representation, see its origins. They're actually talking about taxation on their favorite caffeinated beverage. So although we just talked about how the American Revolution as a social influence drove the consumption of coffee in the United States, it actually had the opposite effect in the UK. It drove tea sales in England because of basically that same idea, that to be someone who drank tea was to express your loyalty to the crown, to the current government of England. So that same historical event having opposite effects in different locations. In terms of tea production, tea is grown primarily in China, Sri Lanka, India, and Indonesia around the world, and still primarily picked by hand. A single worker picks about 10 pounds of tea per day. And then in terms of processing, the tea leaves are then dried. They're rolled to weaken the cell structure, and then they're placed in a cool, damp place where they ferment. Oxidation helps to bring out the flavor and the caffeination effect. So, in terms of varieties of tea, you may be familiar with these already, but we're going to run through them to make sure that we are all on the same page. We've got black tea, green tea, and oolong tea. So we talked about oxidation with black tea. The leaves have been fully oxidized. With green tea, the leaves are not oxidized. And then with oolong tea, it's actually a greenish brown, and as you might expect, it's somewhere in the middle, partially oxidized leaves. So that's where those different categorizations come from. It's the same the plant matter is basically the same, it's just the processing that's different. Now, in terms of how tea is consumed, we do see that about 3/4 of the tea that's consumed in the United States is actually consumed as iced tea. Again, if we think about the relationship between caffeinated beverages and sugars, there's definitely some health concerns that we would have if we think about people drinking those sugar sweetened beverages that way. We also drink flavored teas, mixtures of tea with mint or other spices, and then herbal teas. So herbal teas contain other kinds of plant leaves and flowers, but they don't actually contain any of the product that we typically identify as tea derived from that plant species. Now, in terms of caffeine content in tea, pound for pound, tea actually has more caffeine in it than coffee. However, we see a much higher rate of dilution. So 1 pound of tea leaves makes about 200 cups of tea, whereas a pound of coffee makes about 50 to 60 cups of coffee. So more tea per pound, more caffeine per pound in tea, but a higher rate of dilution. If we think back to our statistics on caffeine in coffee, we can compare tea here. Tea has about 40 to 60 milligrams of caffeine per cup, but this does depend again on how exactly that tea is brewed. So theophylline is another member of the xanthine family that's found in tea, but it is found in very small amounts. So caffeine and theophylline both found in tea here, but theophylline is in very small amounts. If it's used in high doses, it actually can be a component of an asthma medication. Please definitely don't take this as a suggestion to drink tea instead of taking your asthma medication, but just some insight into the powerful effects that xanthines can have on human biology. Okay, one more important source of caffeine in American diets would be chocolate. And we'll start here again with the history of its consumption. The origin of chocolate, this one's actually in the Americas. And its original name, Theobroma, here means food of the gods. So again, we're back to legend. It's been consumed for so long that we don't have historical evidence. We just have oral history that the cacao tree was a gift to humans from paradise, so chocolate as a pathway to heaven. It was widely cultivated in Aztec society, and the cacao bean itself played an important part in their economy and culture. So just as we saw the influence of tea and also with coffee, again we see that link to the use of caffeine with economic and cultural history as well. So the original way that chocolate was consumed, it was actually bitter. It was flavored with vanilla but not with sugar. And its name is derived from some Mayan words for a warm beverage. So consumed originally as a in that the same way that we consider coffee and tea. We saw chocolate make its way to Europe in the 16th century. Cortez was the one who brought it, and chocolate drinking didn't spread as quickly as coffee and tea. But by the 17th century, we did see it sold in those coffee houses that we talked about in our mini lecture on coffee. Now, in terms of processing, we did see the same basic traditional approach through 1828, and this is where the pods were dried in the sun and then roasted to remove the husks, and then the kernels were ground. The thick liquid that was obtained we still use today. We consider that baking chocolate now. If you've ever tried a taste of that, that is actually how chocolate tasted, which may explain why it took a while to spread. But after 1828, we saw a new process. It's called Dutch process, still used today, and it basically removes about 2/3 of the fat from the cacao bean, produces what's called cocoa butter and a powder, and the mixture of cocoa butter, sugar, and chocolate powder is what we are much more used to consuming here in the 21st century. At this point, it gets formed into slabs or bars. And then in 1876, we see a new kind of chocolate, milk chocolate, less bitter and a lighter taste, introduced by the Swiss. So lots of changes there in the 19th century. Now, when we talk about the actual xanthine content in chocolate, here we're actually talking about theobromine. So this is a unique xanthine. It's similar to caffeine, but much less potent. It is unique to chocolate. We don't find it anywhere else. And an average cup of cocoa contains about 200 milligrams of theobromine. Now, of course, we don't feel the effects of that the way we would feel the effects of coffee because of the much less potent central nervous system effects. However, typically associated with higher levels of sugar. So if you do consume hot chocolate, feel that kind of increase in energy that we associate with caffeine. To a large extent, that's more associated with the sugar content of that hot chocolate. In terms of actual caffeine, the average cup of hot chocolate or cocoa would contain only 4 milligrams, so much closer to decaffeinated coffee than anything else. Okay, just a quick word on some other sources of caffeine, and then we'll wrap up our second mini lecture here. Of course, an important one now in the modern era in the United States would be soft drinks. We talked a little bit about Coca-Cola when we covered caffeine. I'm sorry, when we covered cocaine. So Coca-Cola was created as a nerve tonic, one of those patent medicines. It was supposed to help you with your mental health issues, which, if you might imagine, it containing caffeine and cocaine may help you feel significantly better at certain times, but may not overall be a well thought out approach to mental health. But its name is derived from coca leaves and cola nuts. And today the coca leaves are still used, but the cocaine is removed. They're decocainized before being shipped to the Coca-Cola plant. Now, we do consume about 45 gallons of soft drink per capita here in the United States, so about 45 gallons of soda each per person per year. And we also see caffeine delivered in energy drinks, which is a growing segment of the market. We do definitely have some health concerns with caffeine delivered in this format, and they are starting to compete with soft drinks, but not necessarily a very healthy alternative. And then we do also see caffeine delivered just in pill form, medications such as Vivarin that people may take when they need to increase their energy level. As well. So in terms of caffeine content, if we look at the content per serving for several of the different formulations that we've talked about here in our lectures, we've got variation for brewed coffee and instant coffee, and also for tea. That will depend on how it's prepared. And then we also see the various caffeine contents for different soft drinks. Diet Coke at about 47 milligrams, so about the equivalent of a kind of a lighter, less intense coffee. And then Red Bull delivering about 80 milligrams, so kind of the highest of our soft drink alternatives. The caffeine content of chocolate bars, and then finally Vivarin, definitely the highest consistent caffeine content. Brewed coffee can compete, but it's going to depend on exactly how that was prepared. So we'll wrap up our second lecture on caffeine here, and we'll be back in our third lecture to talk about the pharmacology of caffeine.